Welcome to Church History and Theology, a study where we glean wisdom from those who came before us. Come, lay aside today's concerns for a bit and join in a study of the church throughout the ages. Our forebears have shaped our faith in countless ways. Let's go look into one of those influences today on Church History and Theology.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Church History and Theology. Tonight is a fascinating episode that I've been long in coming working on, that is Rome of the first century. But before we get into that, I just want to take a minute and set aside a notation, let you know about something that happened this past week. I got to join on a show called Two Creations, One Creator, headed up by a very impressive young man named Isaac Bush. We got to talk about life and church history and Christian witness and the responsibilities that Christians have towards the future. And it was an absolute pleasure of mine to sit down and talk about this. And I want to share with you a short sample. Listen to this. So there is no idealized golden age of church history. There is just fallible people. And somehow through all of that, God is preserving his infallible plan. And I love it.
That's awesome. I have never thought of it that way, because I've always been like a big advocate of like saying, "Oh, we need to be like the Church of Acts," but that's like, no, yeah, that's an excellent point. What you're saying, like, yeah, everyone in history is fallible. We are created for today. People of tomorrow are created for tomorrow.
Right.
That's awesome. I've never thought of it that way. So I'm just kind of like taking that in, like processing it.
We are in a flow of church history. We can't remove ourselves from it. We can't be unaffected by it, and we have a responsibility to hand down to the next generations the story that belongs to us. This is our story. This is our family, and we have descendants after us, future Christians that need to know this stuff. It was a great time of brotherly fellowship, and I would encourage you all, go listen to the interview. Links are in the description. And special thanks to you, Isaac. I look forward to talking with you again. Now, tonight's subject, as I have already said, is Rome of the first century. Rome is a dicey term, and it's one of those that I want to express to you. My main focus here is the city of Rome, but there is no way to talk about the city of Rome without discussing all sorts of other things that it affected. The whole empire, the imperial line, which emperor was doing what when. And so this is going to be an odd mix of church history and Roman history, and as well as some Jewish history. And the point being that these things are so intertwined in the first century that we really can't pull them apart from each other without missing massive sections. So rather than trying to pay attention only to, say, Rome for all of history, I have devised to talk about this in chunks, and tonight is just going to relegate it to the first century. And so I'm not looking to go past the reign of Domitian this evening. So we're going to be discussing pretty much from the very beginning of the empire to the end of the Flavian dynasty. If you are a fan of Roman history and also of church history, well, you've hit your jackpot tonight, because we're actually going to be mixing them all together. If you're not a fan of Roman history but love church history, at least I can maybe whet your appetite a bit for understanding which emperor was going on where, and when one thing was going on here, what was going on over there, and how these things kind of all melt together. If you're anything like me, when you study church history or when you study regular history, you have a timeline in your head, and you tend to keep that timeline parallel with other things going on. You don't really, bind them together very much. And so sometimes it's a little bit surprising who it is living at the same time as other people. So this is kind of one of those studies that I got to piece together that made some connections that I had actually never put together. So I got to learn a bunch in prepping this one, and I hope to pass that on to you. So let's get into this. Rome, if you were unaware, is the center of the world at this point. The first century has seen an inheritance of something brand new in the world, and that is the Roman Empire. Before this, it was the Roman Republic. You had a Senate, you had a certain way that it had established itself after the conquest of so much of the land around the Mediterranean basin. But Rome itself was unable to hold on to a republic. It, as famously retold in Shakespearean plays and many movies since then, and several books on the happening of dictator for life Julius Caesar. After him and his, let's just say his untimely departure from this world, a whole new version of Rome came into existence. And while this is, again, not primarily a Roman history class, it really bears to the mind to open up about the rulers and kind of their happenings, at least to have some hooks into some of the things we know in church history and in the New Testament. If you are ever at a Christmas Eve service, I'm certain you've heard of the decree that went out by Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed there in Luke chapter 2. Caesar Augustus is the first emperor. After the death of Julius Caesar and all sorts of other squabblings and so forth, when we finally figure out who the first emperor is and in retrospect look back and rebuild all this history, we come to Augustus Caesar Augustus. He is the Caesar of Luke chapter 2, and he serves for a tremendous amount of time. Nearly 40 years. He is the Caesar there, and takes care of all manner of things. We're not going to be focusing on him too much because, again, church history. He's the Caesar during the time of the birth of Jesus and the early childhood of Jesus. He dies in the year 14 AD, and so that would make him not the Caesar of later stories in the New Testament. After him is Tiberius. This would be the emperor during Jesus' ministry. He takes on the role in the year 14 AD and continues that for 23 years to the year 37 AD. So this is the emperor during Jesus' ministry, the day of Pentecost, and the very early versions of the church in Rome. Now, as far as for the history of Rome, the city itself is a remarkable place. It holds a centrality due to all of it establishing itself during the first century. While it's doing that, we see this parallel establishing, and that is of the church in Rome. The church in Rome, if you remember the story of the day of Pentecost, was likely begun by Jews who were visiting into Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost, because in Acts chapter 2, verse 10, we have that visitors from Rome, Jews, were there and present and heard the gospel. Presumably, they traveled back and began house churches, and eventually leading to no small dissension among their kin, the Jews of the city of Rome. In fact, there was many early tensions between Jewish and Gentile believers, and there was several instances where the Romans, for the next several decades, tried to figure out how to distinguish between Jews and Christians. It had been very difficult because the concept of being a Jew was not simply an ethnic expression, but also a religious expression. And then to be a Christian, most of them in the early days especially would be seen as both Jews and as Christians, and it was for the Romans quite confusing. This understanding of maybe the Christians are a sect of Judaism, they're a part of this, they use the same scriptures, and the Roman Empire for the first about 100 years could not fully distinguish between Jews and Christians. Later on, one of the ways that they were able to distinguish between Jews and Christians in the early 2nd century is that Jews defended themselves and Christians wouldn't. Jews, by and large, were quite militaristic, and especially when self-defense came about, but Christians were almost unanimously pacifists in the first centuries. And so that was one of these things that the Romans could use to distinguish them. Now, lest you think that there was an assumption of nobility connected with pacifism, not in the Roman culture. No, fighting back was seen as respectful, that you respect your life. To be a pacifist, not to defend your own life, is to you say that you don't value your life enough to defend it. Why should I value it enough not to take it from you? Those types of things seriously get into the issues of the issues that Rome had with Christians and deciding who they were with regards to their Jewish ancestry, and at least to their eyes, looking very familiar to them. Well, the visitors from Rome that we find in Acts chapter 2, verse 10, presumably return back to Rome and begin a church there. House churches, several of them. This would have been the habit everywhere in the earliest sections of the church, in the earliest times of the church. And this would be still very, very early apostolic ministry. Now, again, I want to simply emphasize here, if you don't recall this, you can go back to our lesson on Peter. I want to dispel any concept on the front end. Peter in no way has anything to do with founding the church in Rome, outside of, his role on the day of Pentecost. And if you want to call that founding the church, well, there was Christians from every nation among the Mediterranean basin that were present there, that had come and repent and were baptized and joined the church, and even some who then returned home as well. And so there was nothing unique about the church in Rome yet. The church in Rome does become quite unique later on, but at this point, what makes it unique is that it's in the capital city. And the capital city is not some small place. It is not some, minor role that a church in Rome would play. A church in Rome is going to play a central role because it's going to be where all roads lead. It's going to be where, when things happen, it's going to kind of be in the center of it. Not because it has some authority over and against everything. That doesn't happen until centuries from now. It has a familiarity, a centrality, if you will, right? We see the same thing with churches even today in denominations that aren't built on this kind of a concept, where a church that is in a larger city is going to be more prominent in people's minds than an equally valuable church that's in a small town. That's just the nature of it. It's how humans think about things. The same thing goes for businesses. You're not going to find just the amount of people outside of a city as you will inside of a city. Rome is, by the time we come to the first century, it's getting enormous. It is becoming a powerhouse of the world, and kind of the centrality of that really affects the way that the church in Rome functions. But this is one of the great things about the church in Rome. We never have any indication that it gets full of itself in the first century at all. In fact, when you read Paul's epistle to this church that he writes in the year 57, you do not get any concept of correction, nothing like the church in Corinth. Not because they were perfect or anything, but because they didn't have massive issues like that. They had just a unique relationship with being doctrinally sound, and that's marvelous. So did the church in Ephesus, by the way, and so did the church in Colossae to a certain extent. The church in Philippi, even more so, right? And the church in Thessalonica, just on a level unheard of in any other city. But Rome is one of these great cities and has marvelous church inside of it. One that Paul holds very dear to his heart, actually saves the longest letter that he writes for that church. And a remarkable thing indeed, but we're getting ahead of ourselves with that. In the early days, there was a lot of tension between Jewish and Gentile believers. There was difficulties in assessing how it is the relationship between the law, how it is between those who are Gentiles now following a Messiah. But even more than that, you had tensions arising when Jews became Jewish Christians and the relationships they had with their families. That led to such a problematic thing that we actually have to deal with it in history. And deal with it we will. After Augustus comes Tiberius, as we discussed. Tiberius dies in the year 37. And then we have a 4-year instance of Caligula. If you know anything about Roman history, you'll know the infamous reign of Caligula. Only 4 years long. Nothing of note that we're going to take issue with here with Caligula. But we are going to jump straight ahead after Caligula to the next emperor, the 4th emperor of the empire, and that is Claudius. Claudius serves for 13 years as emperor, and he was a very unexpected emperor. He was quite an adept ruler, very effective, good administrator, oversaw expansion into Britain and so forth. But as for the city of Rome, he was more of a developer of new things. He was a developer more than he was of doing new things. He added more aqueducts. He had more agriculture, set up more grain trade that there was, more games, more trade. This was kind of his, as just expanding and growing and growing. He had some spouse issues. He had her and her, I'll keep this PG, her friend put to death. And one of the things we actually see is what comes up is in Acts chapter 18. This is the Caesar in Acts chapter 18, verse 2, that expels the Jews from Rome in the year 49. In fact, we have the Roman history, Suetonius, who mentions disturbances that were caused by Christus, which would be the Latin version of Christ. That there was a disagreement among the Jews in the city of Rome so significant that he threw them all out. Whatever exactly happened, I think it's pretty straightforward what would have happened. It would have been whatever was going on in Jerusalem just exploded into Rome. These would have been Christians that had Jewish heritage that were arguing, that had disputes with Jews who were not messianic and following Christ. And so there was significant issues that actually led to the expulsion of Jews from Rome. And that is the majority of the earliest church. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no Christians left in the city of Rome. Gentile believers would have stayed there. And so this kind of whole relationship that goes on, and then there's an expulsion of Jews, expulsion of Jewish Christians. Well, that doesn't last forever, but it lasts a good while. It really goes until the end of Claudius's reign, as best as we can piece together. And so that's another 4 or 5 years until Claudius is poisoned by his new wife, so her son could become emperor. And that's kind of how Claudius ended his reign. At this point, Christians presumably were able to return back to Rome, and those who wanted to. If you remember in the book of Acts, even those like Priscilla and Aquila were cast out of Rome at this time, and presumably after the reign of Claudius would have been able to return back. Well, after Claudius, his wife's son becomes emperor. The famed emperor named Nero. And he takes over in the year 54, and here's where really our major story starts taking over. Because as far as for everything that's going on in the New Testament, we just kind of passed over a lot of sections that we just don't know the datings of in certain things. But once we come to the late 50s and the early and mid 60s, now we have all sorts of New Testament tie-ins. And the reign of Nero overlaps all of this. So, for instance, when Paul is appealing to Caesar, the Caesar at the time is Nero. He's a crazy person. He serves as Caesar for 14 years. He's only 16 years old when he comes to power and becomes emperor. So it makes perfect sense why he would be crazy. Well, his mother, Agrippina, just a beautiful name. If any of you are having a little girls lately. Agrippina is a name you should probably suggest to your wife. His mother, the widow of Claudius, ruled through him in the early days. Well, later on, Nero ended up having her killed. That's a whole nother story. But and afterwards, kind of was guided by Seneca and Burrus and some of these others. But it kind of descends into all sorts of paranoid, tyrannical things. He loved the theater and games. He really loved chariot racing. But more than that, he loved singing and playing the harp and acting, things that emperors do not do. Well, some of the things that are going on during his reign that tie us in with church history really kind of grounds some of the stuff that we know. When Paul is in Corinth and he writes to the Church of Rome, what we know of as the Book of Romans, this is during the reign of Nero. This is in the year 57 AD. Again, Nero is serving from 54 to 68. In the year 60, Paul arrives in Rome. And he had appealed to Caesar, that's Nero at the time, and is under house arrest and awaiting trial. And he writes many of his letters, his prison epistles from here, and others. There is some story that Paul was released for a short time and arrested again, and so forth. That would have probably been about the year 63. It is about the year 63, at least as best as I can piece together, that Peter and his wife arrive in Rome for reasons actually unknown. And for best as we can tell with any actual reliable data, this is the first time they've been to Rome. That doesn't mean it is. We just don't know before that. Why he is there, we're not really sure. One theory is that he is there as part of the defense for Paul. There's actually a theory going around in scholarship right now that Luke writes the book of Acts as a defense for Paul, which is why it ends where it ends. Peter may have been there backing up the claims that are in there, since the first third of the book is about him, but that lends some credence, but we really don't know. But what we do know is that Paul and Peter are both in Rome in the mid-60s, and they're in Rome when the Great Fire of Rome breaks out. The Great Fire of Rome breaks out in the year 64. And what happens is that Nero immediately blames the Christians for this. Why he blames the Christians for this is something we do not fully understand. But you get multiple Roman accounts of this as well, saying we were aware that it wasn't the Christians that did this, but it was Nero himself that did this, wanting to actually, scapegoat Christians in order to put forward his own building projects, because he started magnificent building projects right after the fire. It really didn't help quell down any of these suspicions. Tacitus actually writes of this, that the fire was an absolute devastation of the city, and there was a lot of people suspicious of Nero's involvement, not just officially, but even in the streets, people, just citizens. That gets really difficult. Well, Nero uses the Christians as a scapegoat, and he does it in pretty horrible ways. Every historical testament that we have regarding this is that it was brutal. Tortures, public executions, crucifixions, beheadings, all manner of things going on during Nero's persecution. One of the concepts, though, of this that I want to quell is the idea that this was somehow empire-wide or anything like that. Nero's persecution of the Christians was not empire-wide. It wasn't even all peninsula of Italy-wide. It was Rome and the surrounding areas, just the city. And so this is one of those concrete moments in Roman history that we understand to have been the source of persecution of Christians. There's others that have more question marks, but Nero's is well documented. The church during the reign of Nero really had difficulty explaining itself. Why it is that Christians were blamed for this is something that we really don't fully know. There are a few theories about it. There's a few ways to piece things together, but their return after the Jews were expelled, Jews tend to not really return back to Rome in the same kind of numbers that Christians do. So there may have just been an ongoing prejudice that alongside the idea that Christians are just absolutely pig-headed, just like Jews were, with regards to we are not going to worship the Roman gods. We are not going to give money or say prayers to idols. We're not going to do any of these things. Both Christians and Jews are very pig-headed about this kind of stuff, and rightly so. But one of the theories, and I think one of the ones that convinces me a little bit more, is that Jews that were expelled from Rome that weren't Christians did not return in the same numbers as the Christians after the expulsion and Claudius and Caligula and all this. So it may have just been an ongoing problem. And as far as the public was concerned, those annoying Christians, of course, no problem. And, whether or not Nero is doing this because he thinks the Christians actually did this, or he's doing this to gain public favor, who knows? Who knows what goes on in this guy's head? As far as Christians are concerned, a very misunderstood minority, often conflated with the Jews. So there's even more problems with that because, honestly, the Jews and the Romans are not getting along very good either at this time. The mid-60s are horrific. And by the time we really delve into this, you have just a whole pile of confusion about what's been going on. Well, here's kind of the crazy thing. The time, we're not quite to the Flavian dynasty yet, but the time that goes on towards the end of Nero's reign, the Jewish revolt in Judea starts. And that would be the year 66. Now, here's kind of a bigger part of this. The issues that were going on in Judea absolutely influenced some of the things that are going on in Rome. So do the ones going on in Rome influence the ones going on in Judea. This whole thing is intertwined in ways that we really can't fully grasp. Now, Nero has all of his problems at home. He loves to be at home. He's a bit of a strange cookie, as it is. When the Jewish revolt breaks out in Judea in the year 66 AD, one of the most popular generals is actually sent to quell and subdue this, and it's a man named Vespasian. His conquering of the countryside in Judea, the subjugation of everything in the north, and then coming down and stopping short of actually coming up to Jerusalem yet. Some of the stories that come out of this are just mind-blowing, with the amount of brutality that goes on. And Vespasian at this time returns to Rome. There was some needs to happen there, and he left a lot of this in the hands of his son, a man named Titus, and we'll come back to him in just a little bit. In the year 68 AD, so a year and a half, 2 years into this Judean quelling, Nero commits suicide. The Senate had declared him an enemy of the state due to a whole host of issues, and, well, mainly Nero was just the worst. And so upon committing suicide, the entirety of the Roman Empire for the next year kind of falls into one of its shortest civil wars. In the year 69, in 68, it is known as the Year of Four Emperors. And there is a civil war. It lasts pretty short. By the year 69, we have Vespasian actually becomes installed as emperor by all of the military. All these others that were attempting to do things, there was short little emperor service, 5 months here, 4 months, this, that kind of stuff. But as far as for meaningful emperor, Vespasian is the next one. He starts in the year 69. Now, I want you to think with me on this. When Nero had put his persecution out to the church in Rome, two very notable figures were put to death there. As far as all history is concerned, everyone is unanimous on this. Paul and Peter were both martyred in Rome. Now, as far as for the actual method and how this worked, Paul being a Roman citizen, and what we have from history as well fits perfectly, was beheaded and buried in Rome. Peter, not being a citizen of Rome, was crucified. This would have been common to do so. He was also, according to multiple accounts, his wife was martyred right before him, at which point he encouraged her to remember the Lord. And the story of him being crucified upside down is a later embellishment from the Acts of Peter. That's something that I would take with a very large grain of salt. That he was crucified, however, is almost undoubtable, and that plays a role in the future. He was buried in Rome as well, best as we can piece together. Again, you're separated out from a lot of history here, but it is wise for us to take note of that as we pass by it, even before we come to the Flavian dynasty here, starting in the year 69. By the year 69, the Jewish revolt in Judea is at a fever pitch. Vespasian's leadership in the war was up to the year 68. He left the command of his son to his son Titus and returned to Rome, becoming emperor in the year 69. The year 70 is absolutely central to Jewish history because it is when Titus destroys the temple in the year 70 AD. The siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple is a subject for another episode. That is not going to be my focus here. We will talk about it on another episode because there was aftermath for both Jews and Christians in the empire that is really important. But I don't want you to think that I'm passing over that. It's just not the subject of tonight's episode. But the reason I bring it up is because it is the effect that it had on the city of Rome can still be seen when you visit Rome. Vespasian restores the stability after the chaos of Nero's death in the year of the four emperors, the short civil war that took place. Christians recover from Nero's persecution, that immediate persecution of Nero's reign, where you have some of the more gruesome pictures that are given to us, even to the point of him covering them in pitch and hanging them on stakes and lighting them on fire during garden parties. That the kind of stuff that Nero was involved in was insane. People hated this guy, and but he also misused funds and built things for himself. He built this huge golden house for himself and his own Colossus of Nero, his own version of himself. Testimonies are that it was anywhere from 100 to 120 feet tall. This kind of stuff doesn't really sit well with the populace, especially when you're taxing them for things that are beyond anyone's sanity. Well, the fascinating thing is that when Vespasian came to power, he stopped a lot of the insanity, a lot of the waste, and what he ended up doing was using a lot of the valuables that his son Titus took from the Temple of Jerusalem to fund the building of the Colosseum. The funny part about this story, and Vespasian is the one who begins the Colosseum here, but the funny part of the story is that Nero's famed Golden House was on the site of the Colosseum first, complete with artificial lakes, and as I already mentioned, the Colossus of Nero, a 100+ foot tall statue, yes, depicting him naked. If you've ever seen a picture of Nero, you'd understand just how much the citizenry hated having all of that over their heads. Vespasian had it all demolished and all razed to the ground and built the Colosseum. And then there's in fact, if you actually visit the Colosseum, I got to see this last year, right next to the Colosseum around the backside is an Arch of Triumph as well. And it is Titus's arch. They are depicting all the treasures coming from the Jewish temple. You have menorahs and everything else. Really awesome stuff. It's still standing there to this day. Amazing achievement, right? All of the wealth that comes from Judea and Jerusalem pours into Rome. They use it to help, and they also take everything that Nero had done, melt all this kind of stuff down. They used it to build the Colosseum. Well, Vespasian had two significant sons, Titus, who was the elder brother, and his younger brother, Domitian. Vespasian dies of sickness about 10 years into his reign, and becomes the first emperor to be succeeded by his own biological son. Before this, it was adopted sons or grandnephews or stepsons, things like this. So Titus actually becomes emperor after Vespasian. It was the natural thing. Titus essentially was the very definition of living in the shadow of his own father. Vespasian was loved by a lot of people, and he was a very well-attuned leader, well-attuned emperor. And as far as for management and administration and everything else was concerned, Vespasian was one of the best that they've had so far. Titus has a very short reign, and unfortunately was marked by a number of natural disasters. And so this is almost everything Titus is remembered for outside of his job as a general, which is just astounding, because as far as for his role in history, and especially church history, he's very much remembered for his role as general taking over the Jerusalem in the siege of Jerusalem. And as far as for when he becomes emperor, he's remembered hardly for anything that he did then, because he wasn't able to do much. He had a 2-year-long reign, and it was marked by a lot of natural disasters. If you're familiar with Pompeii and the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, that happens in the very first year of his reign. As does a plague breaking out, most likely smallpox or something like this, that kills tons of people in Rome. And then on top of that, in the second year of his reign, there were multiple fires in the city of Rome. This becomes really problematic. He ends up getting sick and actually dying soon thereafter. And so Titus's emperor doesn't really last very long. His younger brother, Domitian, takes over. Now, this is where we have to deal with very limited information with regards to church history and the reign of Domitian. As far as Domitian is concerned, we have a lot of information about his reign and who he was and the things that he did. His military triumphs all through the north, Gaul, modern-day France, the area around the Danube, etc. In a lot of Christian history classes, including the very first season of this show, the traditional Christian reputation of Emperor Domitian is that of like second Nero, like that there's this huge persecution that broke out during the reign of Domitian. Had all these harsh policies, wanted to be, he demanded that people worship him as divine with this title Dominus et Deus. The problem is, as I've dug into this more and more, is that a lot of that is hearsay. And a lot of that is written way after the time and doesn't really fit what we know of Domitian. Now, don't get me wrong, Domitian was not some great person, and he really did want to deify other members of his family, and absolutely did. But unanimously, it seems, and universally, from everything that we have, that only happened after they died. And there's really no solid evidence that the Dominus et Deus title was more than an honorary title for people kissing up to him. This makes everything more confusing, because and we're going to deal with this more and more as we get into the 2nd and 3rd century, especially when we come to the 4th century. Writing about Roman history as Christians in a later time about an early history usually gets a lot of stuff wrong. And sometimes it's just for limited information, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? I mean, some people are just, they'll listen to Irenaeus or Hippolytus or whatever and hear this history and go like, oh, well, then that's for sure what happened. The problem is that there's a number of historical inaccuracies in some of these tales, and it really becomes difficult if we're talking about trying to settle out what actually happened, we bump up against what we can't really fully understand or know. The idea that Emperor Domitian demanded to be called Lord and God, and Christians refused, leading to a persecution. These are stories from another era that have very little basis in reality. At best, it is an oversimplification. At worst, it's just mistaken and never happened. And that's kind of this frustration in historical studies, that a lot of stuff happened that doesn't ever get told, and there's a lot of stuff that gets told that didn't really happen. But what we can put together is that Christians' resilience and growing distinctiveness from Judaism does continue on. If the book of First Clement, it seems one of the presbyters at the Church of Rome, it may be written at this time, but again, that becomes problematic as well, because a lot of people date First Clement on this understanding that this calamity that has arisen in the church in Rome was something to do with Domitian. But if Domitian doesn't do that, then that actually puts Clement, First Clement, not in the 90s, but back in the late 60s or early 70s, maybe even mid 70s at latest, right? I mean, he could have been referring to the persecutions of Nero, but he doesn't even say persecution necessarily. He could have been referring to the short civil war they had in Rome. We don't really know. And so this becomes for us really problematic to actually date all of this and to ensure that it all happened. As far as for Domitian is concerned, he was a capable leader. Was he crazy? Oh yeah, he was nuts. But as far as for this kind of, like a Neronian persecution breaking out under Domitian's reign, it really gets dicey evidence we're not really thoroughly sure of. That becomes a problem. And that's kind of the thing too, is that when we read about Nero's persecution, we have multiple sources from all over the place that reference this, and reference that, and it becomes almost undeniable. We don't have the same kind of level of stuff like that for Domitian, just not at all. Maybe there was something that happened, but it's really hard to rebuild. Well, by the time we come to the end of the first century here, and Domitian, he is from the year 81 to 96, 15 years there. The church in Rome, by the end of the first century, looks a lot like the churches elsewise. They would have had a group of presbyters. They would have had multiple house churches. We're not talking about a time where you're building church buildings or basilicas or anything like that. There would have been all manner of attention to theology. Obviously, you have sharp minds in the church in Rome, especially in the first century there. I mean, you don't have a book like the book of Romans written to you unless you have a reputation for caring about things. And that really is the reputation of the church in Rome at the very beginning. They loved theology. They loved being steeped in the Word of God. Their reputation had gone out, and even a reputation for just ensuring that theological accuracy continues. And that is a laudable thing. That's a marvelous thing. As far as this is concerned, though, there's a lot of history that comes later that comes back and rewrites all of this and talks about Pope this and Pope this. The church in Rome did not have popes. There was not monarchical bishops in the first century. That is well known. The only way that you're going to hold to that is if you hold to those who are in error later on in church history about the Church of Rome in the first century. The Church of Rome in the first century is widely understood, and nearly consensus-wise, there were not monarchical bishops in Rome. There was certainly no pope or anything like that. We are hundreds of years away from anything that looks like that. So when you hear church in Rome in the first century, understand it very different. We're talking about an actual faithful church here in the first century that is built on biblical ecclesiology, that saw the martyrdom of Peter and Paul. First Clement is written after the fact of this, and actually saw, and as he says in his own in their own day, they've seen the the faithful witnesses of the martyrdom of Peter and Paul. I mean, that's written by an eyewitness account of somebody who is writing on behalf of the Church of Rome to the church in Corinth. That's a pretty significant testimony to these things, which, means, again, we're probably talking about First Clement being written in the 70s, especially if we're calling into question any persecution under Domitian that actually took place. So First Clement really kind of shows us the attitude of the church in Rome at this time. It's one of my favorite letters, and it's why I released the resource episode on it recently, because I was already planning on this episode. I wanted you to be able to experience how the church in Rome wrote to another church. There was no lording over. There was no our authority this. There's no declaration this. There's no follow us. We're the most holy this. Nothing. Nothing but kindness, fellowship, brotherly correction, no lording over, and an insistence of following biblical patterns. And that is, at the close of the first century, one of the great takeaways of the Church of Rome. At the close of the first century, we're talking about a very faithful church that is able to help others in time of need, and to do so, as the Apostle Paul says in Galatians 6, with a spirit of gentleness. If you didn't get a chance to go listen to the resource episode of First Clement back a couple episodes ago, go take a listen to that. Yeah, I know it gets a little bit difficult to listen all the way through, but I included the entirety of First Clement, as I will be doing with most things that I find important to go forward, things like the Didache, things like the Epistle of Barnabas. I want to expose you to all of these things in early church history so that we can actually hear from their own words what they were like and what was going on. The reputation of the Church of Rome was admired for their charity and their steadfastness during persecution. It was the first church that experienced persecution on that level from a political powerhouse like the Emperor of Rome. Beforehand, you had the church in Jerusalem that was suffering persecution at the hands of the Jews. In Rome, you have a much worse persecution that took place, and it was the church in Rome that was lauded for their faithfulness under fire, quite literally. There was a lot of increasing tension with Roman society after the turn of the first century. Accusations of atheism, cannibalism, and misunderstanding of things like communion. Very anti-Roman sentiment. There's always this kind of dualism going on here, and that is this kind of back and forth. Rome has this, this concept of the eternal city. It still calls itself that, right? But the Christian hope for a city that is not of this world, that is truly eternal. This almost connection to the world as far as for its power and its strength and versus Christian meekness, right? It should not be lost on us that the book of Revelation is also written towards the latter half of in the latter half of the first century, and a good section of the book of Revelation focuses also on this idea that there's evil political and economic forces in this world that seek to unsettle and destroy the church, and yet you have these things controlled by God, these things ordained by God. We can actually depend on the purposes of God in the midst of such things, that the beast will be destroyed. You have multiple reasons to think that this is something quite early on, in the 60s, the 70s, something like this. Well, as we look back on all of this, I think that it's one of the great takeaways of this church in the city of Rome is that we are able to endure all things for the sake of the gospel. The church in Rome became known for its faithfulness, even when every circumstance looked horrible. In the face of an empire that demanded allegiance, the early church clung to the gospel of Christ. Rome claimed eternity. It claimed the world. It claimed military and economic power. But Rome's gone. and the message of the cross has endured. And I think that's one of the greatest perspective setters for Christians in the modern era. Lord's blessings to you all.